Bom dia a todos e a todas. Serei muito breve em minhas palavras nesta manhã e eu quero aqui agradecer ao nosso amigo, embaixador Antônio Harrington, o embaixador que é presidente emérito da seção americana do Conselho Empresarial Brasil-Estados Unidos, o CEBEU, é um grande parceiro da CNI de longa data. E foi graças ao seu apoio incansável que pudemos contar, nesta edição do ENAI, com a honrosa presença do presidente Bill Clinton. Em 2013, a CNI atuou como parceira da Fundação Clinton em suas iniciativas no Brasil. E naquele ano eu tive a oportunidade e o prazer de conhecer o presidente Bill Clinton. Fiz a ele um convite para que falasse aos empresários brasileiros sobre sua experiência à frente do governo dos Estados Unidos e sobre sua visão dos rumos da economia global. O presidente gentilmente aceitou o nosso convite. No entanto, em razão do falecimento do ex-presidente sul-africano Nelson Mandela, não foi possível concretizar esse encontro em 2013. Hoje, passados 2 anos, tenho o prazer de anunciar que o presidente Bill Clinton voltou ao Brasil. Está aqui nesta 10ª edição do Encontro Nacional da Indústria Brasileira. Durante seus 8 anos na Casa Branca, os Estados Unidos assistiram à maior expansão econômica de sua história, com a criação de mais de 22 milhões de empregos. Depois de deixar o governo, o presidente Clinton criou a fundação que leva o seu nome, com a missão de melhorar a saúde mundial, fortalecer economias, promover o bem-estar e proteger o meio ambiente. Senhor presidente, para nós é uma honra contarmos com a sua presença em Brasília nesse nosso encontro. Senhoras e senhores, o presidente Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank your president for that fine introduction. I want to thank our current American ambassador, Liliana Ayalde, for being here, and our former ambassador, Tony Harrington, who worked with me for many years for his role. And I have many other friends in this audience. I thank you all for coming. I know that Robson was telling me backstage that my wife was here to speak to this group, and since I am unable to run for anything anymore, you've already heard the best part of my family. But I'm honored to be here. I regret that I was not able to speak 2 years ago when you made it possible for us to hold a meeting of the Clinton Global Initiative in Latin America. We had it here in Brazil. We had people from all over the hemisphere here. It was, I thought, a very good meeting. But in light of the challenges that your country and our world now face, it might be a good thing that my visit was delayed. I spend most of my life today out of politics, but close enough to it to try to keep up with what's going on. In my foundation, we try to go across the world and in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and in the United States, seize opportunities or take on problems and do something that is relatively unusual in the larger world. We try to get government, business, and non-governmental groups together. We try to create networks of cooperation. we try to keep a spirit of optimism about seizing opportunities and solving problems. It is sometimes more difficult than others. The main point I want to make today is that I believe if you look at the trend lines, they are far more positive than negative for Brazil. If you look at the strengthening and deepening of our economic and political partnership between Brazil and the United States, it is perfectly clear that our destinies are tied together and that every American has a big interest in seeing your nation succeed politically, socially, economically. It was a great honor for me to be president in the 1990s and to work with President Cardozo to see the birth of the Bolsa Escola program, which did so much good and grew under President Lula into the Bolsa Familia program, to watch Brazil develop a sensible economic policy and to try to help you get over the bump that was caused by the Asian financial crisis in 1998. I have been honored to come back several times since I left office. I believe this is my 11th trip in 15 years. And so I speak today as a friend, but one who genuinely believes that in spite of the headlines and the difficulties of the moment, there are few places with more cause to be optimistic over the long run than Brazil. First, we know we're in a difficult period. When the financial crash hit, beginning in the U.S., engulfing Europe, sweeping across the globe, there were many people who said, well, maybe the center of economic and political influence is shifting to the so-called BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Look how well they're doing. Now we see that Russia is suffering from low oil prices, something you know something about, and the sanctions regime because of the issues in Ukraine, and serious health problems, has a male life expectancy lower than 60 years now. And all the headlines are about the conflicts between Russia and the West. India elected Mr. Modi based on his vigorous economic success in the state of Gujarat in Western India. But so far, the upper house of the Indian parliament has thwarted his most ambitious economic reform schemes. And of course, the biggest problem for you is that China, seeming to get through the economic crash of 2008 so well, eventually had problems because of the manner in which it sought to generate more growth within its economy rather than from trade. So that banking and real estate bubbles developed, and all that has happened in China, with which many of you are more familiar than I, has occurred. That all had a bad impact on Brazil because a significant percentage of your GDP is tied to exports, and a big percentage of your exports involve commodities. And you've had various political challenges here at home. So the temptation is to be very worried. And I know that for many of you this has been quite challenging. But I would like to ask you to think about the astonishing changes which have occurred in this country in the last 25 years. To see the breadth of economic growth and social inclusion that has occurred. To look at the dramatic success Brazil had in reducing the destruction of your rainforest and changing the direction of your energy future, and diversifying your economy along the way. It is natural that negative developments will always dominate the headlines, but the future is more shaped by the trend lines. What are the long-term prospects? And that's what I would like you to spend a few moments thinking with me about today. The world as a whole is beset by enormous challenges that more or less fall in three categories. There are economic challenges rooted in the fact that growth patterns within countries and across national lines tend to be highly unequal, and access to the things which bring the opportunity to raise incomes, including capital, education, healthcare, that access is also unequal. There is a global shortage of jobs for young people, more pronounced in some countries than others. In the troubled economies of Southern Europe, particularly in Greece, the unemployment rate among younger Greeks exceeds 50%. There is a resurgent concern about climate change and the destruction of local resources at a time when economic stresses make it more difficult for people to take serious action. And thirdly, we have seen a really troubling rise of identity politics, emphasizing our differences based on religion or ethnicity or race. Most pronounced with the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, which is arguably the world's most successful negative non-governmental organization, devoted to destroying the national boundaries established in the Middle East after World War I, and proving themselves to be perhaps the most successful bank robbers in human history. They got about $1 billion out of the bank at Mosul. So you see all this chaos all around, and what does it mean? It means that, as all of you know, because of Brazil's increasing involvement in the global economy, we're living in the most interdependent age in history. But it can be positive or negative. It simply means, interdependence, that divorce is not an option. We can't walk away from each other. I'm amused that one of the major debates in the United States and the other political party, not mine, seems to be whether we can build a wall up and down the Rio Grande River and miraculously protect ourselves from all the economic whirlwinds swirling around us. And that somehow, if we become less diverse, we will be stronger. The truth is, we live in a time when borders look more like nets than walls. I turned on CNN and BBC this morning when I got up to see the report of all the European countries meeting on the immigration crisis, and they're seeing from Africa, never mind the much bigger one from Syria, where half the population has now been displaced, and a big percentage of them, as all of you know, have left Syria and come to Europe. Now, all that is going on. Just like in Brazil, the crisis in commodity prices and the fall off in business from China is going on. The political challenges you're facing, they're happening. But I have learned in my increasingly long life that in politics and economics, there are very few final victories and no final defeats. We are in a period that I believe will last for another couple of decades, where there is a great contest between the positive forces of our global interdependence. Brazil and Argentina have the largest swath of 20-foot topsoil in the world. It makes you staggeringly productive agriculturally, and it is a bedrock of not only your economy, but of the world's confidence that somehow we can meet the food needs of a growing world. That didn't change just because the headlines got bad. The fact that Brazil was the first country in the world with a widely spread, wildly diverse population grappling with the AIDS epidemic 20 years ago, the first country to figure out how to treat everybody, and still viewed by the global health community with which I work as the best success story in dealing with a deathly epidemic, hasn't changed. It's just not in the headlines because it's good news and you don't have to worry about it. The fact that you have made a commitment which you can actually keep to reduce greenhouse gases by more than 40% from their 2005 levels, and do so in a way that will take you to 90% of your electricity produced from hydropower and other clean sources in a way that will keep costs down and generate enormous numbers of new businesses and new jobs, is still there. Therefore, my first recommendation is that every morning when you wake up and you read something bad, or you go to work and you look at a balance sheet that doesn't please you, think about the good things that are happening. Think about the positive forces that are going on. Not to be blind to the problems, but to remember that your great country is no more immune from the negative forces than anybody else, but you have far more positive assets than most other countries. And if you think about the nutritional needs of a growing world, the energy needs of a growing world, the power you have to help avert the worst consequences of climate change, and the openness with which you are confronting your current political challenges, I think there is a very good chance that 5 years from now, you will be wondering what you worried about so much now. The world needs a successful Brazil. The United States desperately needs its largest partner to build in the Americas functioning democracies with good economies that at worst are a bulwark against the damaging ethnic and religious and other conflicts sweeping the rest of the world, and at best are a gateway to a more integrated global economy in which we share the future on positive terms. We are just in the middle of a painful, uncertain, uneven transition. There are lots of things in the United States we're not very good at. For example, we're doing our best to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that will lead to further reductions in the production and use of high sulfur coal in America. But coal employment in our country peaked in 1920. Coal production peaked in 1950. And yet there are areas where these good people go to work in the coal mines every day, where so many jobs have been lost that more people in some areas get a disability check every 2 weeks than a paycheck. We in the United States have got to work on helping people make economic transitions so you don't waste human capital or natural capital because you can't do what you once did, and yet people are not doing what they could do. These are the kinds of challenges that every great country should be thinking about. Look at Brazil, and when the economic downturn hit you, there was an uptick in rainforest destruction this year, though you're still 80% below where you were at the maximum. You have a huge amount of land which has been cleared, which is arable, which is not being planted or grazed still today. Somebody should be thinking about how to move people, livestock, food growing away from the thin topsoil of the rainforest to the rich body of land not there, even if it requires massive movement. That's hard to do. But the countries, especially the big ones, that make transitions more quickly are far more likely to be successful over the long run. The point I'm making is it's not as hard as going into outer space to find black holes. We have to learn how to do this. But first, we have to have a fix of what our realistic expectations are. The world is awash in positive and negative forces of interdependence. No one can make the negative ones go away, so we should deal with them and reduce them as much as possible. But we should not be blind to the positive forces. For the next couple of decades at least, the job of every citizen on earth, particularly those of us fortunate enough to live in countries with staggering potential, will be to accelerate the positive and reduce the negative forces of our interdependence. To try to keep big bad things from happening and make as many good things as happen as possible. And when difficulties are faced, to be very much better than any of us now are at effecting rapid transitions. I would rather be in your position in Brazil than in most countries in the world. You're going to have a couple of rough years. Commodity prices are down. The Chinese can't buy from you as much. You're working through an effort to modernize and open up and make transparent your political system. Don't you think that it'll be good for you 5 years from now and 10 years from now? I do. I think it's very important that you remember at this difficult time how much the rest of the world is pulling for you and how much people find the energy, the creativity, the sheer capacity of this country to make things happen amazing. It's very important not to back away from being bullish about the future. Your people and your resources and your proven record of making social as well as economic progress should get you through this tough period. Every day, I just got back from Israel, and I went to observe the 20th anniversary of the death of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. I believe if he had not been murdered, we would have had peace between the Israelis and Palestinians by the 1998 or so, certainly by the time I finished serving. But all the headlines there coming out of the Middle East are also disturbing. Violent incidences between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And yet the aggregate number of people being killed on an annual basis is smaller than were dying when I became president. And the economy is booming, and if they can reconcile with each other and make a peace, there is no limit to what they could achieve in the Middle East. And unlike when I was president, all the Arab countries are looking for a stable partner. So every day, they all have to make the same choice you do. And it is personal and psychological, as well as economic and political. Think of this. At least this is true for me. I bet it's true for most of you. Some days you wake up and you're really happy and optimistic. Some days you wake up, your head hurts and you don't want to go to work. Some days you wake up and you think you have a very clear plan for how to get through this rough spot in the Brazilian economy. Some days you wake up and you think, oh my God, we've got these economic problems and this political mess. What are we going to do? Should we be doing more against inflation, or are we going to cut off what little growth we do have if we overdo it? So it's almost like inside we all have a scale. And some days the scale is weighted positive, some days it's weighted more negative. I believe that this group should have as its main purpose until you get through this economic crisis, helping each other to wake up with the scales weighted in the positive direction. Name me another country on earth with the natural and human resources and potential that Brazil has. Name me another country on earth living in a neighborhood relatively free of the kind of religious and racial and ethnic hatreds that are crippling the Middle East and North Africa today. In this decade, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are supposed to be in Africa, though they're starting with a lower base than you have. And yet they have to think about all the time now whether the kinds of allegedly religious conflicts which have engulfed the Middle East and North Africa are going to spread other places, where people use religion as an excuse to grab more power and more money and more control over other people's lives. So I ask you to think about that. Every day involves choices. Yes, sometimes all the choices seem uncomfortable, but if you think you're going to get out of it in good shape, it will lead you to a whole set of different priorities than if you think the ship is sinking and you better be on the last lifeboat. The ship of Brazil is not sinking. And the future will be great if you work through this and if we in the United States can restore higher rates of growth, more broad-based prosperity, and a greater sense of partnership. But it begins in understanding that a lot of what you're dealing with is literally perfectly predictable and less foreboding. How would you feel if you were running businesses in Greece now and you had to read people say bad things about your country? You know, the average Greek works 25% more hours every week than the average German. They're not lazy. They have a rich country. But they have had a government which made promises to its people it couldn't keep for decades. And they actually have a constitutional system which exempts people with lots of resources from paying any taxes at all, which means ordinary people are reluctant to do it. They have a whole different set of problems, but it's a rich country. As long as you have breath and life and creativity, with the explosion of technology in the world, you have possibility. If you tack onto that all that you have here, I believe that you have to feel good about your future prospects. So the trick is, how do you get through the rough part, and how do you, at the same time, plan to accelerate the potential of the future? Tens of millions of people in this country, and far more beyond your borders, are riding on the decisions you make. Their hopes, their dreams for a future that is characterized by inclusive politics, inclusive economics, and an inclusive sense of society. That is what I want to encourage. A few years ago, I was invited to come here to a conference on the environment and climate change. Then the meeting was in Manaus, on the edge of the rainforest. The thing that struck me was, it's the only time I had been to a meeting like this where there was so much diversity of opinion, where there was industry, there were natural resource industries, electric utilities, the people producing the biofuels, representatives of the Green Party, everybody. And instead of arguing with each other, they were all sitting at little round tables, talking to each other as if they were all intelligent, all loved their country, all wanted the best outcome. I think about those tables often when other places I work in are having conflicts. The tables of different people with different attitudes in a relatively small place in Brazil that will have a relatively massive impact on how the world deals with climate change. You have about 20% of the world's biodiversity in the rainforest. You produce about 20% of the world's oxygen from non-ocean sources. Yet you have a resource that is under current systems, yours alone to decide what to do with. And I think of that meeting, and I think if the world can establish networks of positive cooperation to offset the negative forces, whether it's terrorist groups like ISIS or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, or people who are destroying natural resources instead of sustaining them, or people who believe companies should be run only for the benefit of those who put money into them as opposed to those who put their work and sweat and lives into them. If you think about the networks of cooperation and what they can produce and what they have produced in this country, again, I will say, look, I know this is tough, but nobody gets a free ride in life. Nobody. There are no permanent victories. So the thing that matters is the trend line. And what you all have to keep in mind is the phenomenal distance you have traveled in the last 25 years alone. And to keep the trend line going. to never forget on any given day, no matter how bad it is, the massive God-given advantages you have in the land, the sun, the human resources, the diversity. There is no way the world was ever going to make all these transitions that we're being forced to deal with at the same time without disruptions and imperfection. Complexity invites error, but also creates enormous opportunity. Whether the opportunities swamp the errors or the errors paralyze the opportunity, that's up to us. We can't control all the circumstances, but we have total control over how we respond to them. I could have been, for most of the last 15 years, a paid public relations person for Brazil. I speak all over the world. I work all over the world. In small private meetings and large public ones, I have praised this country, not because it is perfect, because it is powerful in a profoundly good way. And look, I could give you some more specific examples, but the main thing is you're in a tough spot right now. But you should be profoundly optimistic about the long-term prospects. Your people are as gifted as they were 6 months ago. Your resources are as important to the rest of the world as they were 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago. And your ability to set an example of creative cooperation stands in stark contrast to the kinds of conflicts that are eating the world alive in the Middle East and other places. So I hope, to go back to what I said about all of us having scales inside that are a little bit tilted toward hope or a little bit tilted toward fear, when we wake up in the morning, I hope you keep pushing on the hope side of your scales. The great Venezuelan, now American, political thinker Moises Naim wrote a book called The End of Power. The title is misleading because he did not really say that power has come to an end in nation states. What he really said was, in an interdependent world, power is more dispersed. It's so trying to amass it, organize it, and direct it toward a specific goal can be like trying to keep water in a bucket with a lot of holes. It requires creativity and continued energy. But the most important political book I have read in the last 3 years was written not by a politician or an economist, but by a Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist named E.O. Wilson, who is now nearly 90 years old. It's called The Social Conquest of Earth, in which, in a very small book, Dr. Wilson attempts to trace the history of all life on our planet, from the beginning. He says the following. You don't have to buy the book, I'll tell you what it said. Although I wish you would, it's a great book. He said, if you look at all the species that have ever lived since the emergence of single-cell organisms, you have to conclude that the most successful ones were ants, termites, bees, and people, because they had more chances to be destroyed and were not than any other species. And he said the great thing about ants, termites, and bees is that they evolved into cooperators. And the cooperation made them resilient and hard to destroy, even in adversity. Last summer, for example, my daughter and I went to visit one of our partners in the effort we're making in Africa to save the elephants. We went to an elephant preserve with 900 elephants, and among other things, I saw 3 anthills that were about 6 feet tall, about this tall. And in one of these anthills, the ants had built their home around a tree so they could have shade. And the minute they reached the leaves, they stopped. And they did it all with no brain, as far as we know, all by evolution. Wilson says people are the greatest cooperators because, unlike ants, termites, and bees, they have consciousness and a conscience. Those are great assets and sometimes great burdens. It means sometimes we think we're smarter than we are, and it takes us too close to destruction before we finally wake up and decide to take the next step in our own evolution. We now have sequenced the human genome. We know, for example, that every non-age-related difference you can see in this audience, including gender, is rooted in only 1/2 of 1% of our biological makeup. Yet we still live in a world with a limited consciousness where we spend 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% of ourselves that are different from everybody else. Think what would happen to our decisions about economy, about society, about politics, if we spent just a little more time remembering that our differences are a tiny percentage of the biology that is our lives and our whole human race. To me, Brazil's progress in the last 25 years, the attempt to preserve the rainforests and to be fair to the native tribes while developing the economy, the Bolsa Escola and Bolsa Familia programs, the development of your own energy resources, and a commitment to generate 90% of your electricity from water and other clean resources. All these things going on at the same time. Even the political crises and the effort to build a more open, more transparent political system worthy of a great growing country with a more dominant position in global affairs. There is so much more good than bad. And the trend lines for the future will make the world need you to be successful more than ever before. Remember the book, The Social Conquest of Earth. The world belongs to the cooperators. I have seen Brazilians across every sector of the economy and society cooperate to conquer AIDS, to get the children in school, to modernize the economy, to diversify the energy, to preserve the planet. And you've just begun. So I ask you to think about that. You know, in my years in politics, I became known as the comeback kid, which was a delicate way of saying I seemed to wind up in a hole repeatedly and had to claw myself out of it. But if you think about it, it's a pretty good metaphor for life. Nobody gets a free ride. Nobody gets a life without challenge. Do you really believe there's another country on earth better positioned than Brazil to claim the benefits of the 21st century? The answer to that is no. Therefore, we have a simple job, each in our own way, to build the positive forces and reduce the negative ones that are bringing us into a new future. A new world is being born. There are birth pains. But at least you are at the head of the parade. So don't get discouraged. Think about how to create new patterns of creative cooperation. Deal with what happens and know that better days are ahead. Good luck, and God bless you. Thank you.
Solicitamos a todos que permaneçam em seus lugares até a saída do presidente Bill Clinton.